students, let's pick up where we left off last time, describing the parts of the brain. Last time, we learned that the brain has three major parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how the brain is structured and organized. First, it's important to note that the brain is actually comprised of two halves, which we call the right and left hemispheres. That word hemisphere should be familiar to you from geography, where you've learned that the Earth can be divided into halves, called the northern and southern hemispheres. You can also see this on our picture here. The picture is the bottom picture. You can see a division right down the middle of the brain, right there. By the way, again, I guess I should orient you before I start drawing on this. This is the front of the brain. And you are looking at a view from the top, or a bird's eye view. So looking down on the top of the brain. Okay, so this is a top view. And so from this top view, you can actually see both hemispheres. Over here, you have the right hemisphere, and the other one would be the left hemisphere. These two hemispheres are connected by a structure called the corpus callosum. So that is what I colored it in here in green. We can also see it up here. I'll outline it. This brain up here is a brain that is cut in half. So cut right down the corpus callosum. And you're actually looking at the inside of the brain in this picture. But in order to separate the halves so that you could look at the inside of the brain, you had to cut through the corpus callosum here. The corpus callosum, which we'll talk about in class, we'll see it when we do our dissection. What it's made of are bundles of axons stretching from one side of the cerebrum to the other. So we'll go into more detail about that in class. Okay. The next thing I want you to notice about specifically the brain picture at the bottom of the page is that it looks a little strange because it is actually covered in layers of tissue. So you can see that here, it's covered in layers of tissue. That tissue has been cut away in this section so you can see underneath it. But they left the rest of the tissue intact. Those tissues are called meninges, and they're really important to the proper functioning of the brain because they protect the very fragile brain tissue. Remember, your brain is sitting inside your skull, and the skull is made of bone, and so we need to protect the soft tissue from the bone that surrounds the tissue. The other thing about these meninges is that they create a special kind of fluid that nourishes the brain or keeps it healthy. This fluid is called the cerebrospinal fluid. And not only do the meninges produce it, but they also contain it so that the brain can float inside the skull instead of being crushed under its own weight. If you were to just let it sit inside your skull without any fluid surrounding it, it would slowly smush itself under its own weight. Okay. Now we're going to focus on describing a specific part of the brain, the cerebrum. You will need at least 4 colored pens or crayons for this section because we will be shading in parts of the brain as we talk about them. Pause the video now and go get them. This is a side view of the left hemisphere of the brain. Let's orient ourselves to the way this is facing. This is the front. We know that because we've got the eyeball in the front here. Also, this area of the brain that kind of looks like the thumb on a boxing glove points towards the front. Okay? And then this is the back of the brain. One of the reasons that we can tell that is because we've got a structure here that we've identified before. Remember from last time, hanging just below the cerebrum, towards the back of the brain, is the structure called the cerebellum. Okay. Recall that the cerebrum is this part of the brain. Hello, highlighter. Okay. This part of the brain here, which is what we typically think of as the whole brain, but it's not. Recall that the cerebellum and the brainstem are also parts of the brain. But outlined in blue here, we have the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebrum is made of 4 major areas. The first are the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are here. In the front of the brain. You can shade them in. You'll notice I used the plural. I said frontal lobes with an S. That's because, remember, we're just looking at one hemisphere here. There's a whole nother hemisphere on the right side of the brain. So this is the left frontal lobe. There's also a right frontal lobe on the other side. The frontal lobes are responsible for the following jobs. First, they are in control of complex thinking, as well as decision making. Your emotions and personality are also in part controlled by this area of the brain. And then finally, the initiation of movement. Remember last time we said that word initiation meant starting your movement. So knowing that you want to stand up or raise your hand, that gets started in the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobes. Okay, the next part of the brain is this one here. You can shade in with me. Okay, these are the parietal lobes. This part of the brain interprets sensations, such as pain and pressure and temperature and the texture of objects you might be encountering in your environment. Without this area of the brain, when you're in contact with something, you might not even know it. You would have a hard time interpreting what you were in contact with. In addition, this area of the brain plays an important role in helping you to understand language, especially complex language, the type that distinguishes the human species from all the other species. All right, next we have the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes are found on either side of your brain. Again, if this brain looks like a boxing glove, then the temporal lobe is the thumb of the glove. Okay, so you can shade that in. Oops, not all the way up there. The temporal lobes are responsible for interpreting auditory information. The word auditory means sound information, information that would be coming from your ears and going to your brain to be understood or to figure out what that sound is. In addition, this lobe also stores memory. I'm actually going to color code these. You should do this too. Why don't you color code them? Actually, it probably wouldn't hurt also to label. This is the frontal lobe. This is the parietal lobe. This is the temporal lobe. And then our last one are occipital lobes. The occipital lobes are responsible for interpreting visual information. That is, information that comes from your eyes and needs to be sent to your brain in order so that you can actually, quote, see the image. The image, your eyes don't actually do any of the seeing. The eyes just gather the information. It's your brain, specifically this region here, that does the seeing, that takes those light signals from the eyes and turns them into an image. Okay. So that is your occipital lobe. Okay. One more thing you should note, we did not color in the cerebellum because it's not part of the cerebrum. Another thing we did not color in, this area here, which you might recognize as the brain stem. Which, of course, is going to be connecting the rest of the brain to the spinal cord. Okay, so I just threw a lot of information at you, new information at you, and I don't want you to become overwhelmed. So rest assured that we'll spend a bunch of time in class this week practicing with this information, going through it, using it to interpret scenarios, etc. And eventually that should prepare us for our sheep brain dissection later in the week. Okay, don't forget your Quizmodo and have a good night.